Egypt had a union federation completely under state control. The wave of strikes that you had in 2006, 2009 were wildcat strikes, out of the framework of the unions and anything organized. In a sense, and they were based in the industrial centers of the country, quite similar to the ABC strike movement that preceded the fall of the dictatorship in Brazil, and which led to the creation of the CUT and later the PT. Quite similar, the strikes, not the, well, I will come to the second stage. The workers went into strike on February 8, and you had a massive, hundreds of thousands of workers going on strike. On February 11, 3 days later, Mubarak resigned. So the fact that the workers' movement, the strikes, joined the movement was decisive in toppling in Egypt as in Tunisia. Stage one. But now we are seeing in Egypt, since 1 month, a new wave of worker strikes. All sectors, from university professors to bus drivers to textile factories to whatever. Not a single social sector has not seen strikes in recent weeks. So we have a new wave of social strikes pointing to a really deep-rooted social problem, and therefore to future stages of this revolutionary upheaval. Now, what you had in Egypt is, I go back to my analogy with the strikes and then Kuti in Brazil, you had the formation of an Egyptian Kuti, if you want. That is an independent federation, a federation of independent trade unions, was created after the overthrow of Mubarak. And it has now, it claims now 1,500,000 members. The Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions. So for the first time for many, many decades, you have a massive independent trade union movement in this country, and it is led by left-wing or progressive nationalist figures, not Marxist, but progressive nationalist figures. So these are for these two countries. It was possible to topple the head of the state in Tunisia and Egypt because it wasn't, I mean, you had a continuity of the state apparatus before the dictator and after the dictator, in the sense that these were not patrimonial states, to use the jargon of social science. You can say they were neo-patrimonial to some extent, but not the kind of really patrimonial states that you have in some other countries of the region, including, I mean, usually patrimonial states in the Weberian jargon lead you to think of monarchies. But in the region, we have republican monarchies. And when you say ruling family, it's not necessarily a monarchy. It can be also a republic, as is the case in Syria or Egypt. These two states are really patrimonial states in the sense that the ruling family owns the state, has reshaped the whole state. And even if you take the core of the state, the hard core of the state, the armed forces, whereas in Egypt, the armed forces could take their distance from the head of the state, Mubarak, and his family. In Libya and Syria, the elite forces, the hardcore of the state, the key armed forces, are completely controlled by the ruling family through familial, sectarian, religious sectarian, tribal ties. And that's why in Libya and Syria, you could not see the same process as in Tunisia and Egypt. It's not possible. That's why in a country like Syria or a country like Libya, the only way to overthrow the government was through civil war. Without civil war, it could not have been toppled. Now, in Libya, it even took foreign intervention to counterbalance the force of the regime armed groups. In Syria, there is a difference with Libya. So you see how if you need to study revolutions, you have to study the state. State and revolution is the equation you have to study. The state, you look at the hardcore, you look at the army. In Syria, contrary to Libya, there is a conscript army. In Libya, the army was dissolved by Gaddafi and reduced to Praetorian Guard of the regime, private militias, including mercenaries, anything you want. In Syria, the elite forces are also tightly, organically linked to the regime. But there is a conscript army because Syria is confronting Israel. So they need to have a conscript army. And that's why you have in Syria increasingly splits of soldiers splitting from the army, sometimes with low-ranking officers. The higher you go in the hierarchy, the military hierarchy, the more it is under sectarian control by the regime. The sectarian minority, the Alawites in the country, are the overwhelming majority of the officer corps. But when you go to the lower ranks, the soldiers, especially in the conscript army, you have that. So what we are seeing now in Syria is the beginning of a process that might lead to a full-fledged civil war. If it doesn't lead to that, if the regime manages to remain, it will mean a very bloody repression of what exists, even bloodier than what we have seen until now. In Yemen, yet again, you have another case of a country which is with much more backward, let's say, pre-capitalist social formation compared to Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, or even compared to Libya because of the economic difference. In Yemen, very poor, very backward country, you have a tribal split and a regional split of the country, which explains the situation of what we could call a cold civil war. I would call that a cold civil war. Instead of fighting, you had demonstrations, mass demonstrations for and against the regime. It is slightly slipping into a real civil war, but there are regional and international interventions to try to prevent that from happening. So we can see, therefore, the variety of situations, the variety of the nature of states, which explains, and the variety of the nature of the social structures and social forces that explains the various dynamics. Finally, and I'm concluding on that, as prospects, as I said, this is a long-term process that started, a protracted process. It may take much more months, it may even take years and years. And after all, we have seen revolutionary processes in history taking decades even, and no one knows how long this one will be. And no one can tell or predict the outcome. It's open. We have to contest, a competition if you want, of several political and social forces. These forces are those who were dominant in the social protest in previous decades, as I said, the Islamic fundamentalist forces. And it is natural that having been dominant in the social and political protest, you can see them in the first elections, like in Tunisia, they achieve a big score. That's, I would say, normal. They were the only one with a real organization, a real force, and plus they have a lot of money coming from oil countries, monarchies. Then you have a mixture of liberal forces, from liberal in the economic sense, some of them, to the layers that I mentioned, the liberal in the progressive sense, in the political sense. And you have left-wing forces which are trying to reconstruct, but they are quite weak over the whole region. The left is quite weak. The key problem is, until now, the lack of political agency of the workers' movement. This can be solved relatively quickly in Tunisia because there is a tradition for the union movement to intervene in politics, and we'll have to see if this will turn into a more permanent political representation of the workers' movement. In Egypt, this is a big gap. You have now a very strong new union movement, a very strong kuti, if you want a Brazilian analogy, but there is no workers' party. And you feel, and this is what is missing in the political map, in the political landscape. And the same will go for other countries. In Libya now, you have a new federation of independent trade union movement that has been created recently. If the Syrian regime is toppled, this will happen there also. The key point will be whether this union movement will also produce a mass-based, union-based political movement of the workers. I think this is the key condition through which this upheaval can ultimately be successful in transforming the conditions of the region, not only democracy, and we know from history, even with the cradle of democracy, Britain, that the workers' movement is essential to any democratic transformation. And this applies to the region, of course. And the second, of course, is without a strong workers' movement, there can be no change in the social economic structure that can open the way for the development of the productive forces in the region that has been blocked over so many decades. Thank you very much.
Algumas perguntas. And with short answers.
Faço questão de falar em português. Eu sou Ana Maria, professora na Universidade Católica de Minas Gerais. Eu queria que o senhor comentasse uma avaliação de um professor brasileiro, especialista em ciência política, professor José Luiz Fiore. Ele disse em entrevista à imprensa brasileira que ele acredita que a OTAN ela tenha um objetivo, entre outros objetivos, o de formar uma cadeia de forças entre esses países com revolta popular para fazer face, o apoio da OTAN teria o objetivo de fazer face à expansão do fundamentalismo islâmico, o que atenderia ao interesse de países hegemônicos como os Estados Unidos, etc. Então, na avaliação do professor Fiore, haveria essa intenção geopolítico-estratégica por trás da operação da OTAN. Eu gostaria que o senhor comentasse esse tipo de análise. O senhor concorda com esta visão?
Meu nome é Jorge Romano, sou da Universidade Federal do ABC. Achei muito interessante sua exposição por ter enfatizado o papel dos movimentos operários, os sindicatos, que exatamente a imprensa enfatizou muito o papel que havia de fato do Facebook, mas colocou pouco a luz sobre esse papel estratégico dos movimentos, dos sindicatos até agora e para o futuro. Mas a minha pergunta é com relação ao Marrocos, porque Marrocos é um país que tem todas as questões estruturais que você colocou como pano de fundo das revoltas. Marrocos tem experiência de organização dos trabalhadores, teve várias revoltas nos últimos anos, tem uma influência da experiência de organização dos trabalhadores migrantes na Europa, que tem um impacto também, e porém, o que a gente percebe assim de longe, parece que a situação lá não foi tão influenciada, e que queria entender como você explicaria o caso específico de Marrocos. Obrigado.
Professor, a impressão que eu tenho a gente observando um pouco o que acontece nos contextos dos países árabes, a impressão é que a violência física, o armamento, a disputa física violenta, ela é central depois de anos de despotismo e um processo de transformação que se dá por guerra civil. E a democracia, o processo de construção democrática, tem que lidar com essa situação em que a violência estava presente no conflito político. Então, eu queria só que o senhor falasse um pouco se essa impressão da centralidade da violência no contexto do conflito político, ele está presente, ou se isso for verdadeiro, então se essa centralidade da violência para o conflito político for verdadeiro, quais são os desafios que isso coloca para a construção democrática nos próximos anos?
Okay, thank you very much for questions. I will take them in the order that they were put. The first one, I will not comment on the professor you mentioned because I have not read, but I will just comment on what you said. So I will take it as a straight question, not a comment on anybody. NATO, of course, the intervention of NATO in Libya was meant to respond basically like any intervention by any power anyway, Western interests. There are several types of interests engaged. One was to compensate for the attitude of Western powers to Tunisia and Egypt, which was seen by large masses as one of collusion with the existing dictatorships. If you take the case of Tunisia and you take the most active country, NATO country in Libya, which is France, at the beginning of the Tunisian events, the French government offered technical help to the dictatorship in repressing the movement. And this led to a political crisis or scandal in France, so they had to compensate for that. So there is this aspect. Then you have the case, of course, the fact that Libya is an very important Mediterranean oil country, very important from that aspect. And there is something at stake there. In the intervention, NATO was trying to hijack the movement, but I mean, the Libyan rebellion asked for UN protection, and therefore NATO intervened. They were adamant on saying, we don't want ground troops, we don't want troops on the ground, because they have no confidence. They know that Western powers have interests. I mean, everybody in the region knows that. Everybody in the region knows why the United States invaded Iraq. That it's not for democracy that the United States invaded Iraq, but to try to control this very rich oil country. So they didn't want any troops on the ground. And I can tell you one thing, even in Iraq, with close to, at some point, to 250,000 troops on the ground, the United States was defeated. It is now leaving the country, it's a real defeat. for the US project. They were not able to control, even in Iraq. How can one think that they can control Libya without troops? They can't control anything. They had a real leverage as long as the fighting was going on, because the Libyan movement needed the NATO planes intervention. When this will be finished, they won't have any real leverage. So one thing is what NATO wants or wishes to do, the other thing is what they can achieve. And I can tell you one thing, they can't control at all the process in the region. As for countering the Islamic forces, this is wrong. This is not what NATO is at. On the contrary, we are seeing a kind of new deal between Washington and Islamic forces in the region. The Muslim Brotherhood have even changed, I mean, Washington changed its attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood changed their attitude towards Washington. And there is increasing cooperation between the two. So the view that NATO is clashing with Islamic forces is not accurate. Actually, the Western countries don't have anything against Islamic fundamentalism as long as it is not anti-Western. The best proof is that the most fundamentalist country on earth is the closest to the United States, the Saudi Kingdom. So, Morocco. Well, there is a movement in Morocco. It's not in the media, because the media only look at the spectacular. It has not been spectacular in Morocco, but there is every few weeks, there is one big day of mobilization organized by what is called the movement, the 20 February movement, which involves these Facebook layers, plus the range of opposition forces from radical left to Islamic forces, and they organize. Now, they started the movement on democratic issues and constitutional issues, which in my view was an error to limit themselves to these issues at the beginning. And the monarchy is smart enough, smarter in Morocco than the Syrian regime, for instance, which is really playing it very stupidly. The monarchy made concessions and even organized a constitutional change and the rest. But now there is a shift in the movement to the social issues, because in Morocco, the key point is not political. It's a relatively liberal country politically. There are freedoms compared to Libya, Syria, whatever. Morocco has more democratic freedoms. So the key issue there is the social issue, the economic issue, which is huge in Morocco. And now the movement is shifting, the demonstrations are shifting to the popular neighborhoods. And we will see what will happen if this movement will be able to gather momentum. And finally, about violence. Of course, when you have civil wars and violence, this represents a challenge for the democratic transformation. But I would say there are two ways to look at it. You had a relatively peaceful process in Egypt, but did it lead to democracy? The problem is the structure of the state is still there. And the regime, as I said, is still there, and democracy is still very much limited in the Egyptian context. Now you look at Libya, or maybe tomorrow Syria. It took a war. The result of the war is that the state institutions collapsed completely. They were destroyed, they were smashed in the civil war, which creates conditions that may be more favorable for a democratic change. Conditions objectively allowing for a democratic change. The key point in Libya, as everywhere, will be the nature of the political forces that will emerge in the coming period and whether we will see some really democratic, progressive, working class pole emerging in the country. This remains the big question. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.